Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. I am here today to talk about my top 10 favorite Victorian classics that I've read so far. So I was very inspired by Kate Howe's series this summer where she ranked the 100 Victorian novels that she's read so far to start my own spreadsheet and keep track of both how many Victorian books I've read but also where they rank in comparison to each other. As of right now, October 2021, in the middle of Victober, I have read 32 Victorian classics so far over the course of my lifetime. So I thought it would be fun to record what my top 10 Victorian classics are right now, and then in a couple of years when I've read more Victorian classics and maybe I'm a little bit closer to that 100 book mark, I can see how my rankings have changed or stayed the same. So I'm going to start from the bottom, countdown style, with my 10th favorite Victorian classic and move all the way up to my number 1 Victorian classic. So coming in at number 10 is The Odd Women by George Gissing. I read this last year as part of the Booktube read-along for it hosted by Katie from Books and Things. I wasn't really active on Booktube at the time, but I did participate in the Goodreads group discussion on this book. And I found it to be a really interesting read that explored Victorian ideals around marriage, spinsterhood, divorce, and the difficult circumstances that lower and lower middle class women found themselves in trying to provide for themselves if they were unmarried. I think I loved this book even more because I had recently read The Five by Haley Rubenhold, which I've talked about so many times on this channel, and the women in The Odd Women are dealing with so many similar themes to some of the struggles that are discussed in The Five, so it was an interesting connection to have just read this nonfiction book and then to read a fiction book that paralleled some of those themes so well. I found it to be a very multifaceted and nuanced novel in the approach that it took to the proto-feminist ideas that it was discussing, and so for that reason it is number 10 in my ranking of Victorian classics. Then coming in at number 9 is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I was lucky that I had been well warned by watching other booktubers' videos about this book, going into this book knowing that it wasn't a sweeping romance or a love story in any way, so I didn't have those problems relating to the plot that some people have going into this book that colors their perception of it. I found it an absolutely fascinating examination of intergenerational trauma and abuse, how fixation and idealization can morph into obsession, the damages of focusing on a romantic idea of how a relationship could have ended up rather than focusing on its realities, and the dangers of love that is not guided by both the heart and the head. I read this book back in 2018 and I still have such vivid memories of the atmosphere that this book created. It's definitely one that I would love to reread in the future, and there's still so many interesting discussion questions and thoughts that I have about this book, and for that reason it's number 9. Then at number 8 we have Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. This is the second full-length Dickens I read, so I read A Christmas Carol as my first Dickens, Oliver Twist as my second Dickens, and then Our Mutual Friend I read in 2017. It was my third Dickens and I read it in the Victorian style read-along that Katie from Books and Things hosted, where we read just a few chapters a month in the order and time period that they would have been released on the original publication schedule. I didn't really enjoy Oliver Twist as much as I thought I would, so I was a little apprehensive that maybe Dickens wasn't for me. So reading Our Mutual Friend and falling in love with the story and the characters so easily was a big relief that I could find Dickens that I really enjoyed. I think the plot of this book, which focuses around a man who made his fortune as a dust collector and garbage man, is so unique, and there's so many twists and turns and little things that you didn't see coming that made this book such an enjoyable reading experience. It's one of Dickens' later books, and his characterization is so incredible. The characters really feel like real people and have vices and flaws, but are still lovable, and you can see where they're coming from in the decisions they make. So for that reason, this book is ranked number 8, and there are still 2 Dickens books to come, so Our Mutual Friend was definitely the gateway for me to really start loving Dickens, and for that reason, I'm forever thankful for this book. Then, book number 7 is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I read this book in 2017, which was my first full year participating in Victober. I had joined in at the tail end of 2016, but 2017 was the first time that I really intentionally set out to make the month of October about Victorian literature, and I remember that year there was a prompt, I believe, to read a Victorian book by candlelight or something like that, and so I read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde all in one sitting with some candles, and it was just such a perfect spooky atmosphere to read this. It's really more of a novella-length horror story by the famous Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson. I love Victorian literature that's set in the city of London. I find there's something so atmospheric about the foggy, gaslit lamp streets of London. That's one of the things that I love so much about the Sherlock Holmes stories, and that atmosphere was definitely also captured in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so for that reason, and for the wonderful memories of the reading experience that I have with it, it's number 7 on my top 10 list. Then book number 6 is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. That's the second Dickens in my top 10. It took me quite a while to get through this book, but I'm so glad I persevered with it because I absolutely fell in love with the characters in this book, particularly Esther. The title, Bleak House, probably should have been more of a warning for me that this wasn't going to end up a perfectly happy story, but there was still a particularly sad moment in this book that left me absolutely shocked. I didn't see it coming at all. I remember I was cooking supper and listening to the audiobook, and when this particular event happened, I literally just shouted no and stood there in shock for a couple minutes, being like, what just happened in this book? So definitely a plot that swept me along and characters that I came to really care about. As always with Dickens, it was an impressively intricate and interconnected storyline that illuminated various social issues in Victorian England. And while I was reading this book, I ended up finding a family history connection, which you know that I love to do in books that I'm reading, which is that my 5 times great-grandfather was a marine store dealer, which is the same occupation as Mr. Crooks in this book. My 5 times great-grandfather ran a marine store in Newcastle for a number of years before his death in 1850, which was just 3 years before this book was published, and then his wife, my 5 times great-grandmother, carried on the store after that. So I absolutely love thinking about the fact that for someone, there must have been one person out there in Newcastle that when reading Bleak House had the mental image of my family's shop when reading about Mr. Crooks, which absolutely thrills me. Of all of the Dickens that I've read so far, I would say to me Bleak House is his most quintessentially Victorian novel, and I love it so much, and for that reason it is number 6 on my top 10 list. Then at number 5 we have The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is my favorite of all of the Bronte novels that I've read so far, and I find it hard to articulate what I enjoy so much about this book. I know a lot of people don't enjoy this one as much as Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, and I'm not sure entirely why I do. I think I found it a bit more uplifting than Wuthering Heights, but not quite as unrealistic as Jane Eyre. And I absolutely love the story arc of this mysterious woman with her young son moving into kind of an abandoned house on the moors and trying to make a living as a painter. Similar to Wuthering Heights, I did really also enjoy the kind of story within a story layers to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, where we start the book from one perspective and then switch into another perspective and then kind of switch back at the end. I found that a really effective way to tell this story, and it really brought the characters to life. So The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is book number 5. Book number 4 in my top 10 list is a very recent addition and one that you're probably sick of hearing me talk about, and that is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I just read this book last month, so it rocketed to near the top of my top 10 list. There's really nothing that I can criticize about this book. I listened to it on audiobook, and it was just the most wonderful reading experience. The tension building that Mary Elizabeth Braddon manages to achieve, even though you kind of have what happened pieced together within the first couple of chapters, watching our main character Robert try to figure out what happened and the tension of wondering if he's going to unravel the mystery in time is so suspenseful, and I found myself like genuinely nervous about what the outcome was going to be. For being kind of a spooky sensation novel, the writing is also so beautiful, and there's some passages of nature writing and descriptions of buildings that are absolutely breathtaking that I actually added to my quote blog of favorite quotes because it was such beautiful descriptions of what a country estate looked like as autumn arrives. And then when I went back to reread that quote, it has incredible foreshadowing for kind of the ending of the book as well. So just brilliant writing. The atmosphere is undescribable. and I can't recommend this book highly enough for people that are looking for a really engaging Victorian page-turner. Then book number 3 on my top 10 list is Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I found this book so absolutely beautifully written, and the characters felt so alive that every time I picked it up to read another chapter, it genuinely felt like I was peeking in on these characters' lives and following along with their daily activities. The characters are so well developed and do genuinely feel like real people that you're following along with their lives. You can totally understand both their redeeming qualities and their flaws. And there's no character in this book that is fully 100% a villain. Even the characters that are a little bit villainous, you do have an understanding of where they're coming from, and that's what makes it feel like such realistic fiction. Even though it's quite a long book, the reading experience definitely didn't feel long or drawn out, and I truly enjoyed every single page of this book and was left absolutely heartbroken that Elizabeth Gaskell passed away right before she was able to wrap up the last chapter or two of this book and give it the ending that it really deserved. So for that reason, it is number 3 on my top 10 list. Then my penultimate favorite Victorian novel is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the 5th book in the Sherlock Holmes series, and it's one of the novels rather than one of the story collections. The case that Sherlock and John have to investigate in this book is whether this village in the moors of England is actually being harassed by a ghostly giant hound, or if there is a more rational explanation. This is another one that I read pretty much in one sitting as part of one of the Dewey's 24-hour readathons, and I read it as a buddy read with my best friend, so there's lots of good reading memories attached with it. It's a wonderfully atmospheric book, and I also love that this is a book where John gets to do some investigating on his own. As much as I love all the Sherlock Holmes short story collections, it's hard to rank where they lie in my favorite books list because there's usually like 1 or 2 really standout short stories, 1 or 2 that I don't love as much, and then a bunch that are really good, but it's hard to kind of know then where to rank the books. So I noticed when I was ranking the 32 books that I've read so far, the standalone novels were ranking higher than the short story collections, even though there are some short stories that I really truly love, and would probably be higher up if they were ranked individually. But I found The Hound of the Baskervilles to just have everything that I love in a Sherlock Holmes story. It was a gripping mystery with these questions of supernatural events hanging over it the entire time, and there's lots of wonderful scenes of rushing around in the moors and in this big Victorian estate house in the middle of the night that just make it a wonderful Victorian read. The Sherlock Holmes stories have such a special place in my heart, and for that reason, this book is number 2 in my top 10 list. And then we have finally reached number 1. My favorite Victorian novel of all time so far is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This book I read in October last year and was one of my favorite books of last year, so if you watch my October wrap-up or my favorite books of 2020, you will see me raving about this book. The 3 words that really sum up my initial reaction to this book are moving, emotional, and haunting. I absolutely tore through the audiobook for this. Literally, of the other full-length Dickens books, I don't think there's one that I've finished in less than a year besides this one, which I read in less than a week. I love this book so much, and I feel kind of mixed feelings having it as my number 1 Victorian book because it is Victorian historical fiction. It's set during the French Revolution, so it's not actually set during the Victorian period, which does kind of make me feel weird about having it as my number 1 Victorian novel. But the connection that I had to the characters in this book and the way that he was able to bring people on both sides of the conflict to life in such a real way. Maybe it's just me, but when I read this book, I really did end up feeling sympathetic for people on both sides of the conflict, and in the end it felt like there was no real villains in this book, which I feel like might be a controversial statement, but I did genuinely end up empathizing with everyone in this story. It's such a suspenseful read. There are so many dramatic events that I just couldn't stop listening to my audiobook because I had to know what was going to happen next. I needed to know if these characters were going to have a happy ending, if they were going to manage to escape to safety or not. This edition has all kinds of wonderful illustrations, and I feel like Dickens really did bring the French Revolution to life in a way that no other book that I have read from that time period did. That might change when I finally get around to reading Les Miserables, but for now, A Tale of Two Cities is My favorite book about the French Revolution. It's my favorite Victorian classic. It's my favorite Dickens. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It's one that I definitely know I will read and reread again and again over the course of my life, and it's just an absolutely incredible book that I can't praise highly enough. And for that reason, of the 32 Victorian classics that I've read so far, it has the #1 spot. So I hope you enjoyed learning about my top 10 Victorian classics. I would be curious to know if any of my top 10 are also in your top 10, or if you think I have given these books the wrong rankings and would want to argue with my placement of these books. I've enjoyed so many of the 32 Victorian books that I've read so far in my life that choosing my top 10 was really difficult, and I'm sure as I read more books in the future, this ranking will change, and that's why I thought it would be fun to document where my top 10 is at this moment in time. So, hope you enjoyed, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Thanks.